All right. So, a little bit of a hiatus. Hopefully, everybody enjoyed their break. I'm going to kind of outline where we're going the rest of the semester. We've got some new material as well. But before we get to that, I've got down here. This week will be the final week of new material. So, we're going to cover monopolistically competitive markets. Module 13. So I've got the practice problems already up there. After Thursday's class, you'll have kind of the final quiz, right? So we've got the module 13 quiz still to go. You'll now see kind of that fifth and final pack back. This is a very open-ended pack back. It's not like the other ones where I have kind of articles. It's more of basically I'm just asking you to tell me something that we've talked about this semester. Maybe using more recent stuff might be easier, and how you would have, you see that in your everyday life, or maybe it's something as like I put some prompts in there. Maybe it's something like we see tariffs, right, which are essentially taxes. How can we expect those maybe to change the price of goods that we see coming from overseas, right? Or maybe there's a certain market of a good that you're interested in, and what do you think, what type of market is that most resemble that we talked about? Perfectly competitive, monopoly. We talked about monopoly competitive markets this week. So keep it really open-ended. It'll be kind of all over the place, but it's a good way for me at the end of the semester to then kind of review those and see what takeaways you have had from the topics we've talked about and how they kind of apply or connect with you. That helps me give better examples kind of moving forward. I've got a couple today, which maybe are a little more relevant to you than they would be to me. But these kind of assignments, these final packbacks, give me kind of a good idea of what you guys are thinking about, right? So it should be a pretty easy one. Get that done. I would suggest kind of getting on this week, getting it out of the way, right? Once you get that done, your score is updated on Canvas. You can kind of see what your final packback grade in that category is going to be. So we'll also have, you can kind of see this one sitting there waiting for after we're done with class today. We'll have two more things of class questions after this week. So that second class questions will be due before we meet in class next Tuesday. We'll have the module 13 reading. Once those have passed, I also have one final assignment. Where is it at? There it is. The module 13 reading would have usually been due Monday, right? This one's a little bit different because of kind of week we didn't meet in class. I just had to replace some videos and Thanksgiving break. I remember, I think I failed to mention the module 13 reading. And so just give you guys a little bit more time. That's due before we meet in class this Thursday. So if you haven't already done that module 13 reading, we are going to start talking about it today. Make sure you get that done before we meet in class on Thursday. Once these due dates start passing, the final quiz, the final module reading, I will get on Canvas and update things so that you can see. Right now, it's kind of worst case scenario, right? So what do I do at the end of the semester? I drop 2 lowest quizzes. So once that due date passes next Monday, next week, I'll kind of get things on Canvas updated. So you can see what your final quiz grade is in that category, and I'll have that factoring into your grade on Canvas. Once the module reading passes this Thursday, I'll drop your 2 lowest module readings. I'll get your grade updated so you can see what your module reading score is on Canvas and have that factored into your grade. Next Tuesday, after we meet in class and that final class questions assignment is done, I'll then get on an update and drop your 4 lowest class questions, get your score updated on Canvas so you have a really good idea of where you're at going into the final, right? I'll also bring in a hypothetical grade tool next week that I show you kind of how to use. It's an Excel file. You just plug in what your quiz, module reading, class questions, packback grades are, like your final grade in those categories. You put in your first 2 midterms. You can then play around with, if I get this on the final, what would my final grade be? If I get this, what would it be? The hypothetical grade tool will also have factored in your CL session points, which I updated them without double checking that all of the CL leaders updated their stuff from before Thanksgiving. So there might be a slight discrepancy in the ones they updated by 1 or 2 different sessions. A couple of them didn't log their previous 2 in. I've now kind of reached out to them. They assume they all have them up to date. So I probably won't get to it this evening, but tomorrow I should get those CL points updated, and they should be a little more consistent with what they actually should be now that they have all that Thanksgiving the week before and the prior week kind of recorded in there. Okay, so you'll see all these things start to get updated. I'll mention this all again next week, so we have a really good idea of where we're standing going into that final. Thinking about you have more than just this class. You should be putting your time towards where it's marginally providing the highest marginal benefit, right? So I want to give you a good idea of kind of where you're at, kind of the cutoffs that you would need. so you can direct your efforts towards either this class or other classes accordingly. Okay. Let me think if there's anything. So that's kind of where we're going. The only other thing I would mention is I put what looks like. And these files were up on Canvas already, but now they'll show up on the homepage. It looks like another module. It's not. It's just next week we're going to be doing review. So I have just like the midterms of practice final, which the purpose is the same as it was for the midterms. There's supposed to be questions that look pretty similar to those questions you can expect to see on that midterm or on the final exam, right? So that would be a really good study tool going into the final. I would first start out with this practice final, then kind of go back, look at old quiz questions, look at old practice problems. Any questions you have over any of those materials next Tuesday and Thursday, I'll be here basically. I'm not coming in with an agenda. I'm coming in and I'm probably just going to field questions. Now, if you guys decide to be shy and quiet, I might pick and choose some things that I think might be important or good to know. But really, it's the most effective if I'm answering the questions that you have, right? You are going through something that everybody, I don't know what all of you find it easy or hard. So I want you to kind of get to look at some materials, bring your questions next class so we can kind of start with those. What modules are on the final? I know I've said this before. All of them, right? No, I saw some panic looks, right? I've said this, not all the modules. The only modules on the final are the last 4 that we've covered since the last exam. So modules 10, 11, 12, and 13, right? Each exam in this class is kind of self-contained. Each one has 4 modules. Now, we're still using things, and you'll see today, I'll do demand shifts. We'll think about firm cost structures. We're still module 9. We're still using all of that. But in terms of the types of questions, it's just going to be from those last 4 modules, okay? So I think I've got, instead of 25, I've got 30. So there's a few more questions, but we've got 2 hours. So more time per question should actually make it a little bit, it's harder material, more time per question. I try to kind of balance things out there. I don't know the room location yet. I was actually sent an email this afternoon. We may not be in this classroom. I was sent an email that I'm supposed to be told tomorrow, although I got an email last week that I was supposed to know Monday. And so they kind of keep kicking the can down the road, but hopefully tomorrow I'll know exactly where we'll be at and I'll kind of get that information out to you well in advance. Okay? So if you have a question, reach out to me individually. They'll have like separate locations for that as well. I'll send out emails. It will likely be on the same day. Yeah, just in a different location. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah. No, once you're done, free to go. Yep. Any other questions? So that's kind of where we're going. We've still got 1 more module of material to go through, which is going to be monopolistic competition. Okay. So like I said, we'll rehash a lot of this next week as well, thinking about the final, going over more details. I'm just trying to kind of create a roadmap. I know Thanksgiving break's a bit of a tease where it feels like everything's done, and then we come back for a couple of weeks, and then, we've got to still finish things out strong. Okay. So we've talked about markets in this last third of the class. So perfectly competitive, monopolies, the modules that I posted videos to replace class with, we were talking about oligopolies, where we only had 2, 3, or 4 firms, although I kept it pretty simple where we just thought about 2 firms. We could use that same principles to apply to 3 or 4, but I kept it easy at 2. We call those oligopoly models. We're now going to be looking at something, okay, let's see if I can get rid of this. There we go. In between, right? So it's like we've got the 2 extremes. We've got a monopoly market, 1 firm, right? Perfectly competitive market, many firms, nobody has control over the price. What we're now going to talk about is kind of like a mashup of the 2, right? So we touched on oligopolies in those recordings that I posted to replace class. This module is going to be about monopolistically competitive markets. So it's a combination of both monopolies and perfectly competitive. So a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about, we're not reinventing the wheel. We're using similar principles from both those markets, but talking about if we had something that had some characteristics of a perfectly competitive market, some characteristics of a monopoly market. Okay. So kind of the key here also to, we've got many sellers, so that looks like a perfectly competitive market. We've got slightly, though, unlike a perfectly competitive market, it's not the exact same homogeneous product. So I was always using like bottles of water or something that's the exact same. Here we've got slightly differentiated products. Right? So what might these examples be? I always use like, fast food hamburgers, Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's, they're all hamburgers, right? But they're slightly different, right? And we'll talk about maybe they actually aren't that different and the companies just convince you they are, right? So what are some characteristics? We've got many firms. Unlike a monopoly market, we've got free entry and exit, right? So firms can enter and exit these markets just like they could with perfectly competitive markets. But we also have slight product differentiation. So it's not the exact same product that every firm's selling. They're selling products that look similar, but slightly different. So you can think about even examples of this. I use fast food. This is one for some reason I always go to. But like clothing, right? I even use like IU branded stuff, like IU branded sweatshirts, just to think about one specific product. There's several different companies that sell those, and they each try to convince you that their product is slightly different than the rest, right? Higher quality, maybe a little bit more unique, right? They're all going to try to create slight product differentiation. I always also use kind of relevant to, although it's probably the time has passed for this, because at least from what I remember, you have to make like housing decisions like a whole year in advance. Like you start as a freshman, and like if you don't make housing decisions in the first month, you're kind of screwed. So hopefully I didn't cause any clinic there. You still find a place to live, but it's harder to find like available places. And so these apartments, what do they try to do? These huge apartment complexes all over Bloomington, they're all bedrooms and a kitchen. They try to set themselves apart by, well, they've got certain amenities. Maybe the location is a little better, right? They're slightly differentiated products. Right? So these are the types of things that we're thinking about now. So, if we just kind of put up like a summary of these things, we can kind of see here we have the extreme, perfectly competitive. On the other extreme, monopolies, many versus one seller. We're still going to have many sellers in these monopolistic competitive markets. Similar or homogeneous products for perfectly competitive. A single product, if I'm a monopolist, I'm the only person selling this. Well, the monopolistic competitive market is somewhere in between, right? It's very similar products, but they're slightly different, right? These apartments are all apartments, but they're slightly, some are a little bit larger, some have different amenities than others. Okay? Excuse me. And then we have this free entry and exit, which will kind of have some implications for probably what we won't get to today. But on Thursday, we'll talk about like long run outcomes in these monopolistic competitive markets. Okay. So in the short run, we'll just kind of go through all these things. And this is really going to be stuff we've already talked about. These monopolistic competitive markets, they make the same profit maximizing decision, or they use the same rule that all of our other firms did. They set the optimal profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Right? Same principle we talked about as the other markets. Now, here, because they sell slightly differentiated product, they have a little bit of market power. Not as much as a monopolist, but they have some market power, right? If you want to get, for using the hamburger example, if you want to get a Wendy's hamburger, yeah, there is only one place you can get a Wendy's hamburger, but there's multiple types of fast food hamburgers, right? So they have to share demand for fast food hamburgers with other companies. But if there's someone who, I have a craving for whatever reason, I need a Wendy's hamburger, well, they're the only seller. So they have some market power, right? Well, what's that going to result in? Just like a monopolist, and we didn't hammer this as much with monopolists, but we'll kind of pop it in this module, is we said, well, they'll choose where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, but then how do they set the price? They went up to the demand curve. So price was always above marginal cost, or we had what we called the markup. So we'll talk more about the markup with these monopolistic competitive firms than we did with a monopolist, because with a monopolist, we couldn't really compare. When there's only one firm. At least when we have multiple firms, we can start to compare their markups. And so they still kind of face this downward sloping demand curve. That's, every market we've looked at faces that, nothing crazy there. So just to kind of compare and contrast, and I'll kind of point out some differences here. So for a perfectly competitive firm, we said their demand curve was the same as their marginal revenue, and they had this, it was just whatever the price of that product was. Why? If I charge the price different than that, how much could I sell? Thinking about gasoline, we said if one gas station increases their prices, what does everybody do? Go to the gas station across the street, right? If I deviate from that equilibrium price, my quantity pretty much goes to zero. Right? Question?
And a lot of things like you're talking about, like stuff like characteristics and stuff.
Mhm.
Talk about like duopolies, like having like having like a thing where they become a monopoly.
Illusion.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like, a lot of this also relates to them too, right?
Keep that in mind. I'll try to mention that later on. More than likely not. So that worked because they were selling the same product in those oligopoly models. Here, if they've got slightly differentiated products, we could still collude. Although we saw even with two people, collusion often breaks down. So you can imagine if it breaks down with two people, what do you think is likely if we've got 50 firms? It's going to be even more likely to break down. So we don't often see it in monopolistic competitive markets because now we're not trying to coordinate the actions of two firms. We're trying to coordinate the actions of 30 firms. And now there's always going to be the incentive to be the one firm that breaks away. So yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. So they're price takers and price setters, right? Because Wendy's sells Wendy's hamburgers. McDonald's sells McDonald's hamburgers. They're setting the price for their specific product. Now, they can get away, right? If McDonald's has built, or I'll use Shake Shack, right? They can charge a higher price. Why? They build up a reputation for their product. However, they're still sharing, or if they go too high, people are going to start saying, well, yeah, the Shake Shack burgers might be a little bit better, but too expensive. I'm going to start substituting away and buying McDonald's hamburgers. So they have some influence over the price, but they still have to be a price taker to a degree. Not as much as a perfectly competitive firm, right? They can still charge a price that's different than just a single equilibrium price. But you'll notice a monopolist, this demand curve, it's much steeper. Now they don't go one-to-one, but a flatter demand curve means that the demand for that product is more what? So if it was completely vertical, demand would be perfectly inelastic. So you'll notice comparing a monopolist, the demand that they face relative to the demand that a monopolistic competitive firm faces, it's not quite as steep, right? If I'm Shake Shack, I can't get away with charging whatever price I want because people will start to substitute away. There are actual substitutes now. So they're still going to face a downward sloping demand curve, but it's not going to be quite as steep. And in fact, all the drawings I'll show you, I try to make sure that the demand doesn't look quite like what it did in the markets I showed you for a monopolist. It's a little bit flatter. Any other questions on this? But to your point, they do have some market power, so they still make a pricing decision based off of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Yep. And I think I left a slide open here because, oh, which one is this? Is this .cam1? I forget now. It's been too long. We'll see if I guessed the right one. I don't think I did. I forgot to grab all my markers, so we'll get a little bit of a reprieve from me talking. All right, so when we're thinking about comparing these monopolies to a monopolistic competitive market, we've got quantity, we've got price. Mm-hmm. The demand that a monopolist would face is going to be the entire demand for that product. So let's say like I was in, a small town. There's a little town north of here called Ellettsville. And let's say they only have one fast food joint, right? One place that's selling fast food hamburgers. They face the entirety of demand. Well, I don't know, population grows and over time there's more companies that pop up. And so now maybe it's not a monopolist, right? Maybe now there's three different cuts, not just McDonald's, it's McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's, right? Excuse me. What's going to be true is we can think about for a monopolistic competitive market, here's maybe the demand that one of those firms faces. It's going to be a portion of the total demand. So it has to be a demand curve that is smaller. Thinking about it this way, if in this room, if 100 of you want to buy, I don't know, Sharpie markers, right? And there's 3 companies here trying to sell them to you. Well, even if they all evenly split, they're not going to be able to all sell 100. They're only going to be able to sell, what, 33.33, right? So if they were a monopolist, they could sell to all 100 of them. So this is the idea that when we have more firms, the overall demand for a product has stayed the same. It's just split across more firms now. And each firm has a slightly differentiated product. So maybe firm 1 has something that people like a little bit more. Maybe people like McDonald's hamburgers a little bit more than they like Burger King hamburgers, right? So these different companies will get a portion of demand, but it may not be split evenly. Some companies might have a higher portion of the overall demand than others, right? Now, just like when we were thinking about how do we get the market demand curve, we said we would take up every individual's demand curve and add them all up. Well, here, this is essentially like the individual's demand curve for Burger King hamburgers, the individual's demand curves added up to get McDonald's. What's the total demand for hamburgers? Add up the demand curves of every firm, right? So each firm is going to have a small portion of overall demand. If we were to add all of these up, we'd be back up to that demand curve that the monopolist would face, right? Because we're adding them all up. Right now, we've got total demand, which is monopolist is only one firm. They face the entirety of demand. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Now, I drew this in a way. I got a question for my last section. I drew these kind of parallel. It doesn't have to necessarily be the case that they are the exact same slope. In fact, if you think about like demand for music, maybe these are like different artists, right? So maybe this is like, I don't know, Taylor Swift, and this is Post Malone or something like popular individuals. What could occur is that the demand for music, there's some overall demand, right? And every artist grabs a little portion of it. You could have an artist who gets a much smaller portion of demand, but notice what's true about the elasticity of this demand curve. If it's steeper, it's a little bit more elastic or inelastic. Completely vertical would mean that it's perfectly inelastic. So this would be a little more elastic. So this might be someone like, I think the example I used in my other section was, I got like some shears. We'll see if it hits the same. Anybody know who Billy Strings is? Nobody? See, that's why the demand curve is that much lower, right? It's a more obscure artist, but it's pretty unique and there's not a lot of other substitutes. So they might be able to get a much smaller portion of the overall demand, but their demand curve that they face might be a little bit more inelastic than some of these other larger artists. Right? So I don't know, music is kind of more of an abstract, harder to think about market, which is why I don't always lead with that. But this might be, I don't know. I used to, what was it called? Henry's Hamburgers or something. Was this like this dine-in, right, joint where maybe people that really like their, personally, they're terrible. They taste like trash. But the people that like them really like them, right? So they face a much smaller portion of demand, but it's more inelastic, right? So the idea to get the total demand curve, we would have to be adding up the demand that each firm faces. That's what I was trying to get at here before I deviated a little bit. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So, all right, we're good. So we've got that they face this downward sloping demand curve. They're also going to face a twice as steep marginal revenue curve when they're setting their price. So just like with a monopolist or a perfectly competitive firm, they have some cost structure. Now, all the same principles apply. Average total cost is this nice U shape where initially we're lowering our per unit costs until it hits that marginal cost where it intersects. We're at the minimum point. Every point past that, average total cost is now increasing. Right? So if I'm making a pricing decision, I should choose the optimal quantity where my marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. Right? So where is that going to be here? At this quantity. Now, do I just simply set the price to be equal to marginal cost? Well, no. I have a product that's slightly different than everybody else, so I have some market power. I know that at that quantity, the amount that the last consumer would be willing to pay is reflected by the marginal benefit or the demand curve for my product. So I go up to the demand curve to set my price. Notice here, if the price is above the average total cost, what should be true about profits? So do we remember what's our profit equation? It's been a second. Yeah, they'll be positive. Why? We calculate profits the exact same way we were for the other markets. It's just the quantity we sell times the difference between price and average total cost. Anytime price is above average total cost, my profits are positive. Anytime it's below, they'd be negative. So here we had an example where because price was above average total cost, we have positive profits. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So let's see. We'll go through losses. Yeah. So we've got positive profits here. Now, we'll go over it a little bit more in detail next class. But if there's positive profits and there's no barriers to entry, what do you think might happen? Other people will look at that market and say, I want to be involved in that market, right? So as firms enter, what's going to happen? Well, we still have the overall demand, right? So if we think about, our hamburger example, well, maybe there's positive profits being made by the existing firms. And so maybe now, I don't know, Shake Shack looks at Bloomington and says, well, we actually could put a Shake Shack in there and earn some positive profits as well, right? So firms will start to enter. But now if the overall demand has stayed the same and we have more firms, each firm is going to be facing a smaller portion of demand. So you can kind of imagine here, the demand curve each firm is going to face is going to start to decrease. Their cost structure hasn't changed, but if that demand curve starts to shift downward, eventually we'll get to a point where profits are no longer positive, they are zero. Or eventually, if too many firms enter, we push demand to be negative, right? In fact, let's say too many firms enter this market, right? Now I've got this kind of lower demand curve that I face. Whoops. Oh no, I don't have it set it here. Well, I would set the optimal profit maximizing quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. I would then go up to the demand curve to figure out what price I can set. Well, now here, price is below the average total cost. So now this firm's profits would be negative. So just like with perfectly competitive firms in the short run, we can see monopolistically competitive firms have positive or negative profits. Now, one thing I didn't mention in the previous slide, I just want to kind of point out here. Notice that the price that they're setting is above the marginal cost, right? And you'll kind of notice here, there's a pretty large markup. Now, these aren't always synonymous, but they are correlated. That when the markup, which is just the difference between price and marginal cost, when that's relatively high, it's more likely we see that firm be able to earn positive profits. That larger the markup is going to kind of tell us there's a little bit more of an inelastic demand for that firm's product. Now, notice when I have this lower demand, now the difference between my price, marginal cost, that markup is a little bit smaller. And that kind of coincides with the firm here, even given the same cost structure, facing this lower demand with this lower demand with a smaller markup is now earning negative profits. All right, yeah. I should be careful with my words. It can lead to negative profits. For sure, what will it do though? It'll decrease profits, right? So it could be that profits are positive, another firm enters, and now profits are a little bit smaller. But if too many firms enter, now the portion of demand that I'm getting, I'm now sharing it not with 3 other firms, I'm sharing it with 40 other firms. Maybe now my profits are negative. Okay. Any other questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So if we have negative profits, what's a second decision we might have to make? In the short run, do I continue to operate or do I shut down, right? So we can operate with positive or negative profits. If profits are negative, we now have 2 decisions. Do I continue to operate and minimize my losses, or is simply shutting down going to be what minimizes my losses? Now, lucky for us, we've already talked about this. The shutdown rule is going to be exactly the same as it was before. So what did we say the shutdown rule was? As soon as the price falls below what? ABC, or average variable costs, right? And we'll kind of go through a model here and I'll kind of show you. So here, where's the profit maximizing quantity, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue? Now I still, when setting the price, I still have a markup here. So even when profits are negative, we still have that markup. It's just that now that price I set is below not only my average total cost, so I know profits are negative, it's also below my average variable costs. Okay? So if it's below my average variable cost, what am I better off doing? Simply shutting down. In fact, let's see, I don't know if I have it in here. No, I don't. You can kind of imagine here, if I continue to operate, here would be my profits, right? So I want to kind of work through just another way of showing you why shutting down is more profitable. And it's a little bit harder to see in perfectly competitive markets. So I'm going to draw it out for you here with these monopolistic competitive markets. Okay. So let's say, and let me think, I'm going to cheat because I want to show you both examples just so you get a little bit, and I forget exactly which one I did. So we did, okay. So I've got one on the slides where I'll show you when it's profitable to shut down. I'll show you one here where it's not profitable to shut down. Okay. So let's say I've got my average total costs, right? I've then got my marginal cost curve here. I'm going to do demand, twice as steep marginal revenue. Here's my, what else do I want? I want there to be, I want to really kind of highlight this. So I'm going to draw it a little bit exaggerated. All right, something like this. Okay, here's my average variable costs. Okay. Now, before we start to kind of think about where the profit maximizing quantity is, things like that, I just want to kind of touch on something, why I'm drawing things the way I am, just to kind of review some things we've talked about in the past. Why am I drawing my average total variable and my average total cost curves such that the gap is becoming smaller and smaller? What's the difference between my average total and my average variable cost? My average fixed costs. My fixed costs are always the same. So as I produce more, what's happening to my average fixed costs? They're being divided by a larger number, so they're becoming smaller and smaller. So the reason why this gap is closing is because the gap is my average fixed cost. So just as kind of a reminder, because we might use this here in a second, that difference between my average total and my average variable is just my average fixed cost. Okay. So I'm going to use some colors so we can, well, yeah, I'll use red first. So where's the profit maximizing quantity, or marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. However, I then go up to my demand curve to set that equilibrium price. Okay. Now here I can see that price is still below my average total cost. So this area would represent my profits, which are negative. Okay. Everybody with me up to this point? Okay. Now, why do I know that that level of profits? I mean, inherently, I can see prices above average variable, right? But I know that if I were to shut down, that these profits are actually a smaller negative value than if I just paid my fixed costs, right? So we know that because of the rule that price is above average variable, but I can kind of give you a depiction as to why as well. So here's my profits if I stay open. If I shut down, let's think about another way I could rewrite my average fixed costs, right? It's just going to be my total fixed costs divided by quantity. So if I shut down, what are my profits? How much money am I making if I shut down? Zero. What do I have to still pay? So my profits would just be negative fixed costs. What's another way I can calculate? And I put total fixed cost, right? Same thing. I'm just using kind of different abbreviations. Well, notice if I just move Q to the other side, the quantity I'm selling times my average fixed would tell me what those fixed costs are. Well, if I'm thinking about graphically, what represents that? Well, the difference between my average total cost and my average variable cost, what is that difference? My average fixed cost, right? So if I think about this rectangle, the height is my average fixed cost. What's the kind of width? Well, I'm going from 0 to my quantity. So I would simply have quantity times my average fixed cost. This larger rectangle would represent my fixed costs. So if I shut down, what are my profits? Negative, whatever this blue area is, right? If I continue to operate, what are my profits? Negative, whatever that red area is. What's better if I'm a firm? Having smaller negative values, right? Smaller losses. So we can see that visually, that shutdown rule kind of play out, right? Anytime price is above my average variable cost, it'll be the case that those negative profits from staying open are a smaller negative value than if I were to simply shut down and pay my fixed costs. Yeah. Yeah, if P was equal to ABC, what would be true? So if I stay open, my profits would be exactly the same as if I shut down. Yep. So we would say there, if the price was ever equal to average variable cost, the firm would be indifferent, right? They would earn the same negative profits if they stay open or if they shut down. Yep. In a very simple model. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Yeah. Here? Yeah, just you could think if you want to. I was just using notation. Sometimes stars. It's not equilibrium. I'm thinking about this is the quantity that maximizes profit. So if I wanted to say like, this is the quantity that maximizes profits, or however you want to notate it. Sometimes I just use stars to identify that's the equal or the profit maximizing quantity. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Okay. So where are we at time? We're doing all right. So what if instead we had an example? Oops. So here's one we just kind of worked through, right? I added to it the fact that we could see I should stay open because my profits were smaller negative values. But if I choose where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and at that quantity, the price I'm setting is below average total cost, but above average variable, yes, I'll be earning negative profits, but I'm better off than if I just shut down, right? This kind of coincides with what we just drew. Although what I drew, I kind of showed you what the cost, I showed you kind of where the fixed cost would be and what those negative profits would be if I shut down. So the flip side of it is, let's say I had a scenario where given that profit maximizing quantity. So when we identify this profit maximizing quantity, we're really saying it's the profit maximizing quantity if we stayed open, right? It still could be the case that the profit maximizing quantity, if price is below average variable cost, is actually 0, right? To not just shut down. But if we were to stay open, this would be the profit maximizing quantity, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We go up to our demand curve to set that profit maximizing price, once again, kind of using stars to represent that. Well, now my price is not only below average total, it's also below my average variable cost. So what should I do? Shut down. I see some people mouthing it, right? But I can kind of show you once again visually why that makes sense. If I stay open, what are my profits? Well, the profit equation we have is just the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm producing. So the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm producing, that's the area of this rectangle, right? Take the length times the width of this rectangle. I guess it depends how you want to say it. The length is the difference between price and average total cost. The width, we're going from 0 to that equilibrium, not equilibrium, sorry. I keep slipping up with that word. The profit maximizing quantity, okay? So here's my profits if I stay open. What are my profits if I shut down here? Well, we said there, it's just going to be my fixed costs, which could be represented by taking the average fixed costs and multiplying it by the quantity. So at this quantity, what are my average fixed costs? Well, that's just the difference in between my average total and my average variable. So if I shut down, here would be my fixed costs, right? Right? Now, I have no revenues and I have, this is my fixed cost. So this would essentially be my profits, but negative. Well, notice this profit value that's negative is a smaller negative value than if I stay open, right? It includes not only that brown area, but some additional amount as well. So anytime that price falls below average variable cost, it's always going to be optimal for us to simply shut down in the short run. Our profits will be negative whenever those fixed costs are. Okay. Any questions here before we keep moving? Oh, yeah, time. All right. Okay. Oh, let me try to anticipate where we're going. I'm already on advertising. I am. So I want to make sure we get through the advertising stuff. If we have time, I'll add in something else at the end. If we don't, I'll kind of throw that into Thursday's class. We should have a little bit of extra time there to cover it. So, all right, we already went through this. There we go. So we now have kind of thought about, okay, these firms, we can identify if they have positive or negative profits. How do they choose the profit maximizing quantity? Sometimes we'll shut down in the short run. So ideally, what do firms want to do? If they're splitting this overall demand, what's their hope? If I'm splitting this huge like overall pot of demand with 10 other firms, I want to try to get as high a proportion of that overall demand as I possibly can. So what might I do? I might advertise, right? So if I have to spend money on advertising, that's going to have two effects. And we'll kind of look at each one individually here in a second. But if I'm spending money on advertising, let's say I can do this at a really low cost. Like, let's assume for a second, it's free. Absolutely does not change my costs at all. So what might this look like? I don't know. Maybe I'm friends, maybe I have a startup and I run in this circle of elites out in out in Los Angeles. And I'm like, okay, you're like the newest, hottest influencer. Here's my product. Make some videos with it. All right. You're my friend. You do it for free. What's going to happen to the overall demand I can get for that product? Do you think, why do companies want influencers to push their products? They think that they're going to be able to sell more. They think they're going to be able to grab a higher portion of the overall demand for whatever product that is, right? Whether or not that's trying to convince you that this new energy drink is like the best new energy drink ever. It's still an energy drink, right? It's slightly differentiated from all the other ones, but they're trying to convince consumers that this one is slightly better, right? Now we're thinking about they're grabbing an overall portion of demand. Remember, what does demand reflect? Consumers' marginal benefits. So what am I doing with advertising? I'm trying to convince consumers that my product is going to provide them with a higher marginal benefit than other firms. Going back to thinking about this, if I can convince consumers that my product will provide them with a higher marginal benefit, I can get a higher portion of the overall demand. My firm can face a higher demand curve. So what is that going to do to this market? So I want to advertise, and we'll kind of go through the more philosophical critiques of advertising here in a second. But let's assume I get rid of this paper that has mark on it. And so I've got quantity, I've got price. Let's say I'm down here. Here's my average total cost. Here's my marginal costs. Let's say originally my demand was right here. My marginal revenue was right here. Okay. So we're going to ignore average variable costs for a second. We'll just assume that average variable costs are low enough that we shouldn't shut down just to make this have fewer things going on in this graph. So we would choose that profit maximizing quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We then set the price by going up the demand curve. So here, starting out, what's true about this firm's profits? Price is below average total cost, so profits are. If you can't answer this question, the final is not going to go well. If price is below average total cost, profits are negative, right? So I start to call in some favors, not spending any money, but I tell all these influencers that I know, hey, can you push my product, right? Well, what can I do? I'm keeping my costs the same, but I'm now able to get potentially a higher proportion of the overall demand curve. I don't know why I chose energy drinks, but we'll just kind of keep running with that example of the energy drink market, right? And then you can kind of think about here. Here's my marginal revenue, twice as steep. Now notice what happens when I increase the portion of overall demand I get, or I increase the demand curve my firm faces. What's going to happen to that profit maximizing quantity? It's going to go up, right? Assuming that costs haven't changed and I've just seen a shift in the demand that the firm faces, they've been able to get a higher proportion of overall demand from this advertising, they're going to choose a higher quantity. Now, is the price still going to be below average total cost here? Be careful. This isn't the price I set, right? How do I set the price? At that quantity, I go up to the demand curve. Right, so be careful, right? You're not done yet. Once you identify that point where the profit maximizing quantity is, to get the price, we then need to go up to where this new demand curve is. Okay. Now, facing this higher demand, I've gotten a higher portion of the overall total demand curve. Price is now above average total, so my profits are now positive. This is a good thing. I'm happy. My company's making money, right? The only problem, so this is great, right? Why don't all firms just dump a bunch of money into advertising and grab as much of the overall demand curve as they the overall demand for the product as they possibly can? Well, I kind of had a pretty outlandish assumption there, which is that my advertising was completely free, right? I didn't change my costs at all. So yes, advertising has this positive effect where it increases the amount that I can sell. It allows me to charge a higher price, right? The problem is what also comes along with advertising? Higher costs, right? So instead of thinking about an example where I'm kind of having free advertising for these influencers, what if I'm Coca-Cola and I just spend a bunch of money on Super Bowl ads, right? I just read some article. I guess people are mad about the new AI Coca-Cola. So they might have actually spent a bunch of money and they actually didn't see that much of a change in the overall demand for their product. But let's just assume they did spend a bunch of money on advertising, increase the demand for their product. The only problem is if in order to do that, they also increase their costs by quite a bit. And here I've got a model where let's just assume their marginal costs are exactly the same. That advertisement was just a huge lump sum, a huge fixed cost. Well, that's still going to shift my average total cost curve, right? So now notice, yes, advertising shifted my demand curve, but it also shifted my average total cost. So now where does marginal cost equal marginal revenue? That same quantity. But if the advertisement not only got me a larger portion of demand, but it came with this huge additional cost, what's now true about my profits? Price is still going to be below my average total cost. My profits would still be negative. In fact, I probably didn't draw it to scale as much, but you can kind of think about here would be my negative profits after advertising, my negative profits before advertising were down here. So I've actually made things even worse, right? I spent a bunch of money, and yes, I have a higher portion of the overall demand curve, but that came at a really, really large cost, right? So the only way that advertising makes sense is if I can spend a pretty small amount of money and for some reason get a much larger portion of the overall demand. So I have to be really careful. That's why firms have marketing divisions, right? Because they want to think about how can I convince people to buy my product or that my product has a higher marginal benefit to them at as low of a cost as possible. So yeah, this is kind of, I know there's a lot going on here, right? We're thinking about anytime we're talking about advertising, there's both of these effects going on, okay? Any questions over anything here before we kind of go back to the slides for a second? Okay. So, if I can convince people that my product is more differentiated than others, we'll actually end up seeing, and I think we'll have time here for a second, I'll draw this out for you as to why, but even if I can keep my costs the same, I don't have to necessarily even increase the overall demand for my product. If I can just create differences in the elasticity of my product, that can lead to higher profit levels or greater markups, price being even larger or even higher above my marginal cost. Right? So we kind of have this disagreement with economists. We can kind of think about there's both of these effects going on, higher costs, but also a higher portion of the overall demand curve. Is advertising worth it? Right? So we'll first go through the critiques of advertising, right? So some economists would argue that it's a waste of resources. So let's maybe think about why. Well, first of all, so how many of you have heard of the show or watched Mad Men? No one? Okay, a handful. It's a great show. But part of the premise is like it's this ad agency, and all they're never talking about making sure consumers like know that this product is better. They're just trying to convince consumers. They're trying to sell the idea of this product, right? So what these firms are trying to do with advertising, they might convince you to think that the marginal benefit of this product is higher, when in reality, once you buy it, it's relatively low. This is like infomercial stuff, right? Like the sham wow or whatever the hell it is, right? They convince you it has this huge marginal benefit to your life. You then buy it. Well, your actual marginal benefit was much lower. You now made a pretty poor decision as a consumer. So that would be kind of one critique, is that it's artificially creating people to think that they have a higher marginal benefit of this good than they actually do. Now, in terms of wasting resources, if all of us, let's say Coca-Cola and Pepsi, right? Let's assume they're the only two sellers of sodas, right? If they spend a bunch of money on advertising, what might it do? So if they're the only two firms, they both spend the exact same amount on advertising, what might happen to the overall portion of demand each firm gets? Well, my spending kind of offsets your spending. So what's happened to the overall portion of demand we get? Stayed the same. But what have we done? Increase that average. So now I don't even get the benefit of having a slightly higher portion of the overall demand. I just get higher costs. So it can be that companies just end up spending money kind of offsetting each other, and we end up with just wasted resources, right? Profits are actually now going to be even lower than they were before. And we can actually model this in a lot of our kind of game theory ways, right? There's always going to be the incentive to be the one firm that advertises a little bit more. Okay? So kind of combining a little bit of what we had in module 12 with what we're talking about now. It can also be that advertising kind of impedes competition. So what can occur is if people think products are different than they actually are, it actually moves us away from a perfectly competitive market. So that's a good example of that. I mean, personally, I think like any cola, I don't know, I'm sure that you can taste test, and I don't think I could tell you the difference between Coke, Pepsi, or Faygo's version of cola, if you know what Faygo is. But all of these companies spend all this money to kind of differentiate their product. If they can convince consumers that they are different, well, now they actually face not a horizontal demand curve, they face a slightly more kind of downward sloping demand. We now end up with something that's closer to a monopolist, which we know in a monopoly market, who loses out? So we said monopolists compared to a perfectly competitive market, the price that they charge will be higher. So who's going to be worse off? Consumers. Right? So if we kind of artificially create this differentiation, we're kind of impeding competition, and we end up closer to that monopoly consumer surplus value than we would the perfectly competitive consumer surplus. So, oops, I have this in here. It's out of order. We'll ignore that. I'll move it for next class, right? Because this is branding, which we'll talk about next class. Advertising, the defense of it would be that it does provide some useful information to buyers, right? Potentially, there are some products I didn't even know exist. And when I look at social media and it pops up on my phone, I'm like, oh, I didn't know someone made that. That would be a huge benefit to my life. So it can provide consumers with some additional benefits, right? They actually realize that these products exist. It also allows for more competition in this regard. The more advertising there is, if I can see that there's 10 different companies selling, I don't know, what would be a good example that you could see on social media? Well, I'll give you a good one. Let's say, like back in the day before you had phones, right, and you wanted to do any sports betting, there was like one firm that did it. There are now several, I don't even know how many there are at this point, apps where you can do sports betting on your phone, right? So you now can kind of shop around to see who has the best deals or who's got the like best betting lines. Well, that's essentially everything. They're spending all this money in advertising. They're making you know what their betting lines are. You now can kind of shop around for a better price, right? So that would be kind of a defensive advertising, that it makes consumers able to kind of have a little bit more power because they're not locked in to this one company that's the only company they know exists. They're now aware of 10 companies that are selling the exact same product. You could even think, if you go back far enough, even things like insurance, right? Or CD rates used to be like, you only knew of the CD rates that existed in whatever banks were in your hometown, right? Now with the internet, that all these different banks advertise it, you can shop around and get the best deal possible, right? Or essentially like the lowest price possible, right? So it reduces the market power of a lot of companies, right? So we like the internet in terms of advertising because it probably is increasing competition, right? One study that I want to bring up is, we don't do a lot with data in this class, but I want to start to kind of mention some things since we're getting towards the end, but a lot of you will do moving forward. Someone actually just talked to me the other day about it. How many of you were signed up or thinking about future schedules, ECON 3.7? Yeah, so a couple of you. It's a very beneficial class. I don't know exactly everyone's class schedule or what your major is, but I'll give you this little unsolicited piece of advice, especially as a business major. And there's other, it's not just econ, it's a stats course, right? If you take a stats course from the math department, or I'm sure they have some in Kelly, your ability to work with data is going to set you up. I mean, you have to have it. Otherwise, you're way down here. Just a million other people just leapfrog you when it comes to job opportunities. You're going to have, when you get out of here, some ability to work with actual data sets. Because we can talk about the theory all we want. We don't know if it's actually going to work until we test it with data. So being able to work with data sets, understanding statistics is going to be a huge tool. So that would be 370. So this is what we do in economics. I'm giving you guys in this class a lot of theories. If you kind of continue to go forward, you also see, how do we test these theories with data? So in terms of advertising, there was this study where it looked at, I guess, like different states have rules about like health things being able to advertise. I would argue, like, for example, pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be able to advertise at all. But a lot of states recognize this, but instead of pharmaceutical companies, it was like other types of health products, and these laws were kind of old. So a couple states had these laws on the books where eyeglass makers actually couldn't advertise. So in these states where they prohibited advertising, it actually led to eyeglasses being more expensive in those states, right? So you would think, well, if these companies are spending money in advertising, maybe they have to increase costs in order to be profitable. So what would this be evidence of? Not the critique of advertising, but the defense. That when we had states that it wasn't prohibited and you actually could advertise, that it made eyeglasses a little bit cheaper. That must be because consumers were able to shop around more. They were able to be made aware of who had the lower price. And we actually see in the data that in those states, the eyeglass price was a little bit lower. So that would be kind of the next step of what you do after this class. Start to go out, think about how can we test a lot of these theories, not just this class, probably a lot of your intro courses. You know, you're just learning principles and theories, and then how do we test this with actual data? Okay. Where are we at in time? Okay. So I won't waste too much time on this. You know, it can be just another thing to mention with advertising. It can be a signal of quality. It could be that companies that spend the money to advertise. Well, if I think my product is completely low quality or it's terrible, am I going to want to spend a bunch of money in advertising? Because as soon as people start buying it, everyone's going to say, yeah, this is garbage, right? So it can be a signal of quality because the only firms who are willing to advertise are companies who are very confident in their product. If they weren't confident in their product, they're worried that if they spend all this money in advertising, once our product gets out there, well, we're not going to get a much larger portion of demand. People are going to realize we're kind of selling a low quality product. And now, you know, we got higher cost, low demand. So it can be a signal of quality that the companies who are putting money into and are willing to kind of spend these large amounts on advertising, they must really believe in their product, right? They must believe they have a high quality product. So it could be that's a signal of quality. It would just kind of complicate our models a little bit further. But that would be another kind of aspect if we're thinking about the kind of, critique or defensive advertising. So we'll kind of save long run stuff for next class, but I do have one more thing since we have a little bit of time that I wanted to kind of cover here. So let's assume we think about these monopolistically competitive markets. Let's assume I have two firms, and let's give them I'm not the perfect drawer, but trying to draw these to be the exact same cost structure. Okay. I'm then going to think about each one of these firms. Let's say here's my first demand and marginal revenue curve that this firm faces. So we'll kind of notice here their profit maximizing quantity, go up the demand curve to set the price. What's true about their profits? Price is just slightly below average total cost, so profits here would be negative. Now let's assume this other firm, okay, has a lower demand curve, lower marginal revenue. And for them, we'll even draw in their average variable cost curve here to kind of see, okay, well, when they are going to set their optimal quantity, oh, sorry, this was firm 2, and set their optimal price, well, not only is their price below average total cost, it's also below my average variable cost. So if we had a monopolistically competitive market, so just two firms selling a slightly differentiated product, what can occur? Well, this firm is going to do what? If price is below average variable cost, they're going to shut down or leave that market. If they leave, what impact is that going to have on firm 1? So what's going to change? Is the cost of firms 1 going to change? Cost the same to produce whatever they're producing. But if they're no longer, remember, this is a monopolistically competitive market. We were splitting demand with this other firm before. Once this firm shuts down, what happens to that demand? It's absorbed by firm 1. They now not only face a portion of the demand curve, they face the entire demand curve. So what can happen once this firm shuts down? Kind of use 3s here to kind of. Well, now the firm that remains is selling a higher quantity. The price they set is now above average total cost, and their profits would now be what? Price is above average total cost. Profits are now. We need to be able to answer this on the final. Price is above average total cost. Profits are positive, right? So this would be an example of something we talked about in the monopoly market. What would this be? What type of monopoly? I put a word in front of it, an adjective, natural monopoly, right? That even if there are no barriers to entry, even if we start out with a monopolistically competitive market, if the demand for the product, there just isn't enough to split between two companies. So the example I would maybe use, I'm picking on Ellisville today for some reason, but the town that's just north of here, they just opened up a Jimmy John's. There is the only other sub shop there is a Subway. My imagination is that town really doesn't have enough demand to support both firms. I would venture to guess in a couple of years, unless population grows, we'll probably see that the firm that faces a smaller portion of overall demand, which I'm just going to go out on a limb and guess is Subway, is going to end up shutting down. There's probably only enough demand in that town to support one firm, right? So this would be the idea that if there's only enough demand to support one firm, we could end up with a natural monopoly. That even though it is a monopolistically competitive market, there's only enough demand to support one firm. Now, if things change over time, population growth, incomes go up, and demand for the overall product increases, well, maybe then that town does have enough demand to support both companies. We're just trying to kind of relate some of what we're talking about today to some things that we've talked about in the past. That would be kind of a pretty strong connection. Also, Someone should have said, I apologize. I didn't realize you can't really tell the difference between these colors here. Does that help a little bit? Can you not really tell? Well, can you tell the difference between red? Okay, I'll start using red more often. My greens and my blues don't look different enough from the darker lines here. But I'm using notation as well, but it's just trying to use colors to make it a little bit easier. Any other? Yeah. So it wouldn't necessarily be an oligopoly. In oligopoly models we were kind of thinking about, they still had a homogeneous product. So here we've added in the wrinkle where they are selling differentiated products. So they both face a downward sloping demand curve. So it's a little bit different. In terms of the number of firms, we could have an oligopoly market look very similar to a monopoly competitive market. And our oligopoly markets, generally the ones that we've talked about in this class, we're assuming they're selling a similar product or a homogeneous product. Here, we're assuming it's slightly differentiated. Yep. All right, any other questions on this before I go back to the slides here? Okay, so we will end this out. Oh, and I'll pull up Top Hat. I think we've just got two here. This should be hopefully relatively easy based off what we've talked about, but I always try to incentivize you actually showing up. So if you're here, it should be no problem once that assignment is set to release, once we're done with class. And I forgot to pull it up. I apologize. My brain is a little foggy these days. So these will hopefully be very easy. I've complicated it a lot more throughout today's class. But if I'm just thinking about the optimal profit maximizing quantity and price, this should be a very easy question. You might see something similar on the exam, right? What would the profit maximizing quantity be here? I choose the profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to margin, so 6 units, and then the price would be $4, right? No, what would the price be? I don't set it where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's just how I identify the quantity. Once I've identified the profit maximizing quantity, I say, how much would consumers be willing to pay? Well, whatever their marginal benefit is, which is where I'm at on that demand curve. So the price that I could set would be $12. Okay. So quantity of 6, price of 12 would be the profit maximizing quantity and price for this firm. Any questions on that? Okay, that one shouldn't be too bad. So the next one, a little bit trickier. Let's say I had something like this. What would the value of my profits actually be here? Well, once again, I'll set my profit maximizing quantity at 6, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I then go up to my demand curve, set the price at 12. So I've kept that part the same. It's just that now, what's true about my profits? The price I'm setting is above or below average total cost. So my profits will be, so the only ones that should make sense are B or D here. If I want to calculate the actual value, well, I'm setting the price to be 12. Setting the quantity at 6, the only other thing I need is at that quantity, what is my average total cost? It's 14. So I would take price minus average total cost. So 12 minus 14 is -2. Multiply that by the quantity I chose, which was 6. -2 times 6 would be -12. Now, just for the sake, so are there any questions on that before I add in what another thing you could be asked about? So let's just for a second assume we wanted to compare. We know that should this firm stay open or shut down? So at that price of $12, what do I compare that to determine if I shut down? ABC or my average variable cost? Well, it's above my average variable cost. So I should stay open. How can I prove this to myself? So we said if we stay open, profits are -12. If I shut down, what would my profits be? Well, we said it would just be negative whatever my fixed costs are. How can I figure out my fixed costs? I can simply take that quantity of 6 multiply it by my average fixed cost, which what is my average fixed cost? It's the difference between average total and average variable, right? So what's the difference between my average total and my average variable costs? Looks like it's what, 14 and 9. So 5 times that quantity of 6 would be 30. If I shut down, my fixed costs are 30, my profits would be negative 30. So shutting down, my profits are negative 30. Staying open, we said our profits are negative 12. It's better to stay open, right? Minimize my losses. So before I just get too excited and pack up and get out of here, those will be the 2 questions that you'll kind of see pop up for the class questions today. If we go back, got one thing, if you want to humor me for a second. I know that things were a little bit different going into Thanksgiving break. So don't make me regret trying to be nice. Okay. So, a little bit of fun. Let me get out still a little bit early. This is where it just kind of quiet down and be all right. So, I appreciate you being understanding. I tried to work through all the old emails. I wasn't able to answer quickly throughout the previous 2 weeks. I believe I'm caught up through Sunday. So if you sent me an email and I have not responded from the past 2 weeks, send me that email again so it pops at the top of my inbox. I'll make sure I get to it quickly. I believe I've gotten through all student emails that came through in those past 2 weeks. So, you know what? All right. So I appreciate that. The patience that you've shown, try to show a little bit more right now. I was going to say thank you that me and my family both appreciate all of that. There we go. All right. So I appreciate you guys. So thank you. All right. Well, now I'm getting applause instead of people packing up and leaving. I should have led with this. No, I appreciate it. I will try to kind of stay on top of things as much as I can over the next week and a half, 2 weeks to the end of the semester. I have a few more things on my plate, but things should be back to normal. Other than that, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Try to stay warm.